The dress was the color of bone, and just as lifeless. It hung on Eleanor Whitmore's frame, a borrowed shroud for a life that was about to be buried. The fabric was cheap, coarse cotton that scratched at her skin, a constant, nagging reminder of her father's fall from grace. It was too large in the shoulders and too short in the hem, exposing the scuffed tips of her worn leather boots. A wedding dress, they called it. To Eleanor, it felt more like the uniform of a prisoner. Her wrists were not bound by rope, but by something far stronger, the weight of expectation, the suffocating grip of a debt she had not incurred. They stood at the edge of redemption, a town that had long forgotten the meaning of its own name. Dust, fine as silt, coated everything, turning the world a uniform shade of weary brown. The wind, a constant mournful presence on the plains, whipped strands of her dark hair across her face, stinging her eyes. Her father, a man who once stood tall enough to cast a long shadow, seemed shrunken inside his threadbare suit. His hand, resting on her arm, trembled. It was not the tremor of an old man, but the palsied shake of a man hollowed out by shame. He was handing her off. The word sounded clinical, like a transaction of livestock, and that is precisely what it felt like. The man waiting for her was a stranger, a silhouette against the harsh afternoon sun. Caleb Rourke. The name was nothing more than a sound to her, a name whispered in saloons and over poker tables where her father had gambled away their last acres, their last hopes, and finally, his only daughter. The townsfolk of Redemption had gathered to watch. They did not come to celebrate a union, but to witness a final, public humiliation. Their faces were a gallery of silent disdain, a collection of hard, unforgiving portraits carved by the unforgiving land. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, picking her apart. The whispers slithered through the crowd, venomous and persistent. "That's Whitmore's girl," a woman with a face like a dried apple muttered to her neighbor, her voice carrying on the wind. "The one whose mother, well, you know." Eleanor knew. Everyone knew. Her mother, a woman of fragile beauty and even more fragile spirit, had walked into the river one spring morning, leaving behind nothing but a note filled with words of despair and the suffocating scent of lilac in her empty room. The town had called it a shameful suicide, a madness in the blood. They looked at Eleanor and saw the same supposed taint, the same crack in her spirit. "Heard he lost the last of his stock to Rourke in a card game." A blacksmith with soot-stained hands grumbled, "A blood debt. Now he pays with his own blood." "And the girl's a wild one," another added, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Eleanor's feet. "Always riding off on her own. Not proper. Rourke will have his hands full taming that one." Eleanor stood rigid, a statue of feigned indifference. She had learned long ago that to show hurt was to invite more of it. She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping over their pitiless faces, letting them see the defiance in her eyes, even if her heart felt like a trapped bird beating its wings raw against the cage of her ribs. Her wildness was nothing more than a desperate search for solitude, a flight from the suffocating judgment of a town that had condemned her for the sins of her parents. At the back of the small, dilapidated church, leaning against the peeling paint of the doorframe, stood Caleb Rourke. He was as still and silent as a mountain cat, his presence creating a pocket of quiet in the buzzing crowd. He was not a handsome man in the way of town dandies. His face was all harsh angles and weathered lines, carved by sun and wind and something deeper, something that looked like sorrow. His eyes, set deep beneath a heavy brow, were the color of a stormy sky, and they gave nothing away. He wore simple, durable clothes, a dusty duster over a plain shirt and worn denim trousers. There was no pretense about him. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a man of the land, hard and unyielding as the rock beneath their feet. He did not smile. He did not move forward to greet her. He simply watched, his gaze unreadable, as her father practically pushed her toward him. "She's a good girl. Rourke." Her father stammered, his voice thick with whiskey and desperation. "A hard worker. She'll make a fine wife." Caleb Rourke's eyes flickered to her father for a brief moment, and in that fleeting glance, Eleanor saw a flicker of something that might have been contempt. Then his gaze returned to her. He gave a single, curt nod. It was not a greeting or an acceptance, merely an acknowledgement of the transaction's completion. He pushed himself off the doorframe and stepped toward her. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was not gentle, nor was it rough. It was impersonal, practical, the way a man might lift a fallen saddle from the dust. His hand was calloused and dry, the skin thick with the evidence of hard labor. He did not squeeze her fingers or offer any sign of reassurance. He simply held her hand, his grip firm, and turned to leave. And just like that, it was done. Her life sold for a gambling debt. She was no longer Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of a failed rancher. She was now the property of Caleb Rourke. They left the town without a backward glance. He led her to a simple buckboard wagon hitched to two sturdy-looking horses. He helped her up onto the seat, his hand on her elbow for only as long as was necessary. And then he climbed up beside her. He clucked his tongue, flicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the silent, staring crowd and the dusty ruin of redemption behind them. Their journey began in silence. It was a silence that stretched and deepened as they moved out onto the vast, unforgiving plains. The land was a sea of dry, yellowed grass that rolled onto an endless horizon, broken only by the occasional stunted juniper tree or jagged rock formation. The sun beat down with a relentless, punishing heat, and the wind, their only companion, never ceased its mournful song. It cut across the open land, carrying the grit of the earth with it, scouring their faces and tearing at their clothes. Eleanor sat ramrod straight, her hands clenched in the lap of her bone-white dress. She stared straight ahead, watching the endless expanse of prairie unfold before them, feeling as though she were being swallowed by it. The silence between them was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, filled with all the things that had not been said, all the questions she was too proud to ask, and all the answers he was unwilling to give. He did not look at her. His attention was fixed on the horses, his hands steady on the reins, his profile as unreadable as a stone carving. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the merciless sun. They traveled from dawn until dusk, stopping only to water the horses and to eat a sparse meal of hardtack and dried beef, which he portioned out without a word. The silence persisted. It became a third passenger in the wagon, a tangible presence that pressed in on them. Eleanor felt as if she were screaming on the inside, a silent, continuous shriek of rage and despair. But on the outside, she was as still and quiet as the man beside her. At night, he would build a small fire, its flickering light a lonely beacon in the immense darkness of the prairie. He would lay out a bedroll for her near the flames and then take his own blanket to the far side of the wagon, putting as much distance between them as the small campsite would allow. He was her husband, yet he treated her as if she were a piece of cargo he was obligated to transport. It was on the third night that the dam of her composure finally broke. She lay in her bedroll, staring up at a sky littered with cold, indifferent stars, the vastness of it all. The sheer, crushing emptiness of the land around her mirrored the emptiness inside her. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek, then another and another, until silent sobs shook her body. She wept for the home she had lost, for the father who had sold her, for the mother who had abandoned her, and for the future that had been stolen from her. She was utterly alone, tethered to a stranger in the middle of nowhere, with no hope of escape because there was nowhere left to run. Through the crackling of the fire, she could feel his awareness of her. She knew he was awake, that he could hear the ragged sounds of her grief. But Caleb Rourke never moved. He never spoke a word of comfort. He never offered a gentle hand or a soothing murmur. He simply lay on his side of the fire, a dark shape against the darkness, and let her weep. His silence was not a comfort. It was a confirmation of her isolation. It told her, more clearly than any words could, that she was on her own. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at his ranch. It was not so much a ranch as a raw scar on the face of the prairie. A small, one-room cabin, its wood weathered to a silvery gray by years of sun and wind, stood against the backdrop of a vast, empty sky. Beside it was a worn corral, its fences in need of mending, containing a small herd of wild-looking horses. They were beautiful, untamed creatures, their coats the color of dust and shadow, their eyes filled with a fiery spirit. They were, Eleanor thought, a reflection of the man who claimed to own them, barely tamed, and suspicious of the world. There was no sign of a woman's touch anywhere, no flower pots on the porch, no curtains in the single window, no sign of the small comforts that might make a house a home. It was a place of pure function, a shelter against the elements and nothing more. It was a place built for solitude. He pulled the wagon to a stop, the sound of the wheels ceasing their grinding complaint, an abrupt intrusion into the quiet. "We're here," he said. His voice was rough, rusty from disuse. They were the first words he had spoken to her in days. He climbed down and, without offering her a hand, began to unhitch the horses. Eleanor sat for a moment, taking in the bleakness of her new home. It was as unforgiving as the man who had brought her to it, with a sigh that seemed to pull all the air from her lungs. She climbed down from the wagon, her cheap dress catching on a splintered board. Inside, the cabin was as Spartan as the outside. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. In one corner was a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a patched quilt. A few shelves on the wall held a small collection of tins and sacks of flour and beans. It was the home of a man who expected little from life and received even less. That night, the unspoken arrangement between them continued. He gestured toward the bed. "That's yours," he said, his tone flat, informational. He then took a single, worn blanket and laid it on the hard-packed dirt floor near the hearth. He expected no words of gratitude from her, and she offered none. She was a possession he had acquired, and he was providing for her basic needs, nothing more. She lay on the bed, still in her wedding dress because it was the only change of clothes she owned, and listened to the sound of his steady breathing as he slept on the floor. He was so close, yet he felt a world away. For 2 days, they lived in this suffocating silence, moving around each other in the small cabin like ghosts. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet and efficient, and head out to work with the horses. She would watch him from the doorway, a lean, powerful figure moving with a quiet confidence that spoke of a deep connection to the wild animals he was trying to tame. She would haul water from the well, the bucket heavy and awkward in her hands, and cook sparse, tasteless meals from his limited provisions. They were a man and a woman living under the same roof, sharing the same space, but they were not together. They were 2 solitary souls trapped in a shared orbit of misery. On the evening of the 3rd day, Eleanor could bear it no longer. The silence had become a poison, and the unspoken truth of her situation was a festering wound in her soul. He sat at the table, cleaning a rifle, his movements precise and economical. She stood by the cold fireplace, her arms wrapped around herself, and the words finally came tumbling out, raw and accusatory. "You bought me," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. "My father sold me to you like a cow at market." He did not look up from his work. He continued to methodically wipe down the barrel of the gun, his focus absolute. For a moment, she thought he would not answer, that he would simply ignore her as he had ignored her tears. But then he spoke, his voice low and even, without a trace of defensiveness. "I didn't want a wife," he said, his eyes still fixed on the rifle. He paused, carefully reassembling the firing mechanism. Just needed to make peace with what I owe. The words hung in the air between them, stark and honest. He had not bought her for companionship, or for desire, or for any of the reasons a man might take a wife. He had bought her to settle a debt. She was the final piece in a transaction, a living coin paid to balance a ledger she had never seen. The truth of it was colder and harder than she could have imagined. There was no room for hope in his words, no possibility of a future beyond this bleak existence. That night, the sky broke open. A storm rolled in from the west, a monstrous, churning mass of black clouds that swallowed the stars. The wind howled around the small cabin, rattling the door in its frame and shrieking through the cracks in the walls. Then came the rain, a torrential downpour that hammered against the roof like 1,000 angry fists. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the stark landscape in brief. Terrifying flashes, followed by claps of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. A primal fear seized Eleanor. It was a fear that went deeper than the storm itself, a terror rooted in the dark soil of her childhood. She remembered another storm, another night of thunder and lightning, and the small, dark root cellar where her father had locked her for some forgotten transgression. She remembered the feeling of the damp earth, the scuttling sounds in the darkness, and the overwhelming certainty that she had been abandoned, left to be consumed by the roaring monster outside. She scrambled off the bed, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and huddled in the corner of the cabin, pressing herself against the rough wooden walls as if she could disappear into them. She squeezed her eyes shut, but she could not block out the memories, the feeling of absolute terror and isolation. A small sound cut through the roar of the storm, the scrape of a match. A soft, yellow light bloomed in the darkness, pushing back the shadows. Eleanor opened her eyes to see Caleb kneeling by the table, the flickering flame of a newly lit oil lamp reflecting in his dark, unreadable eyes. He did not look at her, but he had seen her. He had seen her terror. He rose to his feet, the lamp in one hand, and walked over to where she cowered. He did not speak. He did not touch her. He simply reached down and picked up the patched quilt from the bed. He held it out to her. It was not a gesture of comfort, not an embrace. It was a simple, practical offering against the cold and the fear. Hesitantly, she reached out and took the blanket from his hand, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was warm. She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders, the worn fabric a fragile shield against the storm raging both outside and within her. He placed the lamp on the floor, its steady glow a small anchor in the tumultuous night. Then, without a word, he returned to his own blanket by the hearth, lay down, and turned his back to her. Eleanor stayed huddled in the corner, wrapped in his blanket, watching the lamplight flicker and dance. The rain continued to beat against the windows, washing away the layers of dust and grime that had obscured the glass. But as she sat there, listening to the storm and the steady breathing of the stranger on the floor, she knew that some stains went too deep to be washed away so easily. The rain might clean the windows, but it could not cleanse the dust from their hearts. The days settled into a rhythm as stark and unvarying as the horizon itself, long before the sun bled color into the eastern sky. Eleanor would wake to the chill that seeped through the cabin walls. She learned the heft of the water buckets, the ache in her shoulders as she hauled them from the well, her palms growing rough and calloused. There was a single, stubborn goat with intelligent yellow eyes that she had to milk each morning, its warm flank a surprising comfort against her cheek in the pre-dawn cold. From the milk and their dwindling sacks of flour, she learned to make a bland, serviceable bread. She cooked meals of beans and salted pork, sparse fare that mirrored the scarcity of conversation. Caleb moved through this world with a silent, relentless energy. He was gone from sunrise to sunset, his days spent in the corral with the wild horses or riding the boundaries of his land, mending fences that seemed to hold back nothing but an endless sea of grass. He worked with an intensity that seemed designed to leave no room for thought, a physical penance for some unseen sin. When he returned to the cabin at dusk, he was a creature of exhaustion, covered in a fine layer of dust, the scent of horse and sweat clinging to him. He rarely spoke unless it was a necessity, a curt "more wood" or "the water's low." He ate what she placed before him without comment, his eyes fixed on his plate, and then he would clean his tools or stare into the fire until it was time to sleep on his patch of floor. The vastness of the plains began to work on Eleanor in a strange way. At first, it had felt like a cage, its sheer emptiness a constant reminder of her imprisonment. But slowly, the great silent expanse became a repository for her grief. She would stare out at the rolling land, at the way the wind bent the grass in long, sighing waves, and feel her own sorrow dissipate into the immense quiet. It was too big a place for a single person's pain to hold much weight. The silence, once a heavy, suffocating blanket, became a second skin. It was the language of the land, and she was learning to live within it, to find a strange, hollow peace in its depths. She no longer wept at night. Her despair had cooled into a quiet, simmering resignation, a hardening of the spirit that was necessary for survival. One morning, the axe slipped. She was splitting kindling from a pile of gnarled juniper wood, her mind wandering across the endless prairie. She had grown frustrated with a particularly stubborn log, bringing the axe down with more force than finesse. A sharp, stinging pain shot up her arm. She dropped the axe and looked down at her hand. A deep gash, clean and crimson, gaped across her palm, blood welling up and spilling over her fingers to drip onto the pale, dusty ground. She stood frozen for a moment, surprised by the bright, shocking color of her own blood against the muted tones of the landscape. She pressed her other hand against the wound, a useless gesture that only served to smear the blood across both her palms. A wave of dizziness washed over her. From the corral, Caleb saw. She did not see him approach. One moment he was a distant figure working a length of rope. The next, he was standing before her, his shadow falling over her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on the blood. He did not ask what had happened. He did not scold her for her carelessness. He simply reached out and took her injured hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle. His calloused fingers, which she had only known to be strong and impersonal, carefully pried her other hand away from the cut, his grip firm but not painful. He examined the wound with a focused intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then, without a word, he led her back into the cabin. He sat her down on one of the chairs and went to a small wooden chest in the corner, a place she had never seen him open. He took out a clean strip of linen and a small, dark bottle of whiskey. He poured a little of the liquor directly onto the cut. The sting was so sharp it made her gasp, her whole body jerking. His free hand settled on her shoulder, a brief, steadying pressure. Then, with practiced efficiency, he wrapped the linen tightly around her palm, his movements deft and sure. He tied it off with a neat knot. Throughout the entire process, neither of them spoke a single word. The silence in the cabin was different now, charged with a new, unfamiliar current. When he was finished, he let go of her hand, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second before he looked away. In that brief glance, she saw not pity, but something else, something quiet and unsettlingly human. He turned and walked out of the cabin, back to his work in the corral, leaving her staring at her bandaged hand. Something had shifted between them, a small, imperceptible crack in the wall of ice that had separated them. A month later, a wandering trader, a wiry old man named Jedediah with a wagon full of pots, pans, and gossip, broke the monotony of their isolation. He was the first new face Eleanor had seen since she had left Redemption, as she traded a few of their precious eggs for a small bag of salt. Jedediah looked from her to Caleb, who was watering the horses at the trough, his back to them. "So you're Rourke's woman now," the trader said, his voice a conspiratorial rasp. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice. He's a quiet one, that Caleb. Always has been, ever since the fire. Eleanor's hand stilled on the salt bag. "The fire?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Jedediah's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of sharing a dark tale. "Oh, yes, years ago now, before he came out to this lonely patch of dirt, had a younger brother, Thomas. Wild as they come. A fire started in the old saloon back in Abilene. Some say Caleb started it by accident, knocking over a lamp in a brawl. The place went up like a torch. Thomas was trapped inside." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "They say Caleb got out, just stood there and watched it burn. Let his own brother die in the flames." The old man straightened up, cackling as if he had shared a fine joke. "Got a bad name for himself after that. That's why he keeps to himself out here, I reckon. A man who lets his own brother burn ain't a man most folks want to know." The word struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She paid the trader, her movement stiff and automatic, and watched his wagon creak and sway until it was just a speck on the horizon. The silence he left behind was now filled with the roar of phantom flames and the imagined screams of a dying boy. She looked over at Caleb, who was now brushing down one of the horses, his movements as steady and methodical as ever. Was this the source of the deep, abiding sorrow she saw in his eyes? Was his relentless work a penance not for a debt owed to her father, but for a life he had failed to save? The gossip painted him as a monster, a man who had stood by and watched his brother die. But the man who had so gently bandaged her hand, she could not reconcile the two images. She began to watch him more carefully, searching for clues to the truth behind the trader's story. She studied the lines of his face when he thought she was not looking, the way his hands would sometimes clench into fists for no apparent reason, the haunted look in his eyes when he stared into the fire at night. His silence was no longer just a habit. It seemed now to be a fortress, a wall he had built to keep the world, and his own past, at bay. That night, she was woken by the sound of the cabin door creaking open. The moon was high and bright, casting a pale, ethereal light across the floor. She saw Caleb's silhouette slip out into the night. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, overrode her fear. She rose from her bed, her bare feet silent on the cool dirt floor, and crept to the window. He was walking away from the cabin, toward a small, gnarled oak tree that stood alone on a low rise behind the house. She had never paid it much attention before. As she watched, he stopped beneath its branches. In the moonlight, she could just make out the shape of a simple, wooden cross driven into the earth, a grave. He stood before it for a long time, his head bowed, his broad shoulders slumped. He did not kneel. He did not pray. He just stood there, a solitary figure communing with his ghosts under the vast, silent watch of the moon. Eleanor felt a pang of something sharp and painful in her chest. It was not pity, but a profound, aching empathy. This was his sanctuary, his place of mourning, and she was an intruder. After what seemed like an hour, he turned and walked back to the cabin, his face set like stone. The next morning, after he had left for the day, Eleanor walked out to the grave. The wooden cross was weathered and gray, with a single name carved crudely into the wood. Thomas. She knelt in the dry grass and ran her fingers over the letters. The earth around the grave was bare. She spent the next hour walking the prairie, gathering the few wildflowers that managed to survive in the harsh soil, small, tough blossoms of purple and yellow. She returned to the grave and laid the small, humble bouquet at the base of the cross. It was a silent message, an acknowledgement of his pain. She did not know if he would notice, or if he would be angry at her intrusion. It was a risk she felt compelled to take. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken tension. He must have seen the flowers, but he said nothing. Yet, the air in the cabin felt different, the silence less hostile. But the knowledge of his past, combined with the crushing weight of her own hopeless situation, began to fester inside her. The small crack of connection that had opened between them was not enough to overcome the feeling that she was trapped, a prisoner in a life she had not chosen, bound to a man with a past too dark to comprehend. The breaking point came on a hot, windless afternoon. The air was thick and heavy, the sun a white-hot coin in a bleached-out sky. A sudden, desperate urge for freedom seized her. She could not spend another day in that silent cabin, another night listening to him breathe in the darkness. She had to run. She did not pack anything. She simply walked out the door and started heading east, toward the rising sun, toward a life she could not imagine but desperately craved. She walked for hours, her ill-fitting boots rubbing her heels raw. The sun beat down on her head, and the vast, featureless landscape offered no shade, no landmarks, only the same endless rolling sea of grass. The ranch disappeared behind her, and soon she was utterly alone, a tiny, insignificant figure in an immense and indifferent world. Her throat grew parched, her lips cracked, and every step became an act of will. The hope that had propelled her forward began to curdle into despair. There was nothing out here. No towns, no roads, no people. Only the sun, the sky, and the wind, which was beginning to pick up, whipping dust into her eyes. The sky to the west began to darken, not with storm clouds, but with a churning, brown wall of dust, a sandstorm. It moved with terrifying speed, a monstrous, tumbling wave that would swallow everything in its path. Panic seized her. She turned, trying to retrace her steps, but the wind was a physical force now, pushing her, blinding her with sand. The world dissolved into a brown, howling chaos. She stumbled on, her lungs burning, her boots filled with grit, until her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the hard, unforgiving earth. Through the roar of the wind, she thought she heard a sound, the thud of horses' hooves. A dark shape loomed over her. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her from the ground as if she weighed nothing. She was pulled onto the back of a horse, her face pressed against the rough fabric of a man's duster. The last thing she remembered was the familiar scent of horse and dust and the steady, solid beat of a heart against her ear. She woke to the smell of simmering broth. She was in the bed in the cabin, the patched quilt pulled up to her chin. Her feet throbbed with a dull ache. She looked down and saw that her boots had been removed and her raw, blistered heels had been cleaned and carefully bandaged. The storm had passed. Sunlight, soft and golden, streamed through the clean window. Caleb was by the fire, stirring a small pot. He was not looking at her, but she knew he was aware that she was awake. She lay there for a long moment. The warmth of the bed and the comforting smell of the soup, a stark contrast to the memory of the howling wind and her own despair. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a dry, cracked thing. "Why did not you just let me go?" He stopped stirring and turned his head slightly, his profile outlined by the firelight. He did not look at her, but his voice, when it came, was low and rough with an emotion she could not name. "'Cause nobody should die out there alone." The words were simple, but they landed in her heart with the weight of a revelation. He had not saved her because she was his wife, or his property. He had saved her because he was a man who understood the terror of being alone in the face of death. He was a man who had watched his brother burn. He ladled some of the soup into a bowl and brought it to her. He did not try to feed her, but simply placed it on the small crate beside the bed. She pushed herself up, her muscles protesting, and took the bowl. It was a simple rabbit stew, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. They shared the meal in silence. She in the bed, he at the table. But the silence was different. It was not empty or hostile. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding that had been forged in the heart of the storm. When she had finished, he took the empty bowl from her. "It is not poison," he murmured, his back to her as he placed the bowl in the wash basin. "Just my cooking." It was a clumsy attempt at humor, a rough, unpolished thing, but it was more than he had ever offered her before. A small, Involuntary smile touched Eleanor's lips. It was not a forced expression, not the mask of defiance she wore for the world. It was a genuine, fleeting curve of her mouth, a small flicker of light in the darkness. He turned at that moment and saw it. He stopped, his hand hovering over the wash basin, and simply stared at her. His face, usually so guarded and unreadable, was suddenly open, his stormy eyes wide with a look of profound surprise. He seemed, for a long moment, completely lost, as if he had seen something he had never expected to see, something that had knocked him off his axis. The moment passed, and the mask slammed back into place. He turned back to the basin and began to wash the bowl. That night, as the moon rose over the quiet prairie, neither of them slept. Eleanor lay in the bed, the pain in her feet a dull, distant throb, her mind replaying his words, the look on his face when she had smiled. Across the room, she could hear the quiet sounds of Caleb shifting on his blanket on the floor, the rustle of the wool, the soft sigh of his breath. He was awake, too. The storm had passed, but something had broken loose inside the small, quiet cabin, and in the silent, watchful darkness, both of them knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The shift between them after the storm was as subtle and profound as the changing of a season. The silence remained, a vast and constant presence, but its character had altered. It was no longer the hard, brittle silence of two strangers locked in a cage of circumstance, but something softer, more porous, a quiet space where unspoken things could be felt, if not yet said. It was Caleb who broke the routine. He came back to the cabin one afternoon when the sun was still high, a heavy Colt revolver in his hand. He placed it on the table with a solid thud. Eleanor looked up from the beans she was sorting, her eyes questioning. "You need to learn how to use this," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. She stared at the gun. It was a dark, menacing object, smelling of oil and old violence. "Why?" "'Cause of wolves," he answered, his gaze steady. "Or worse." They both knew what worse meant. It meant men who wandered the plains, driven by desperation or cruelty, men who saw a lone cabin and a woman as an opportunity. The unspoken word hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. He took her outside, away from the cabin, and set up an old tin can on a fence post. He showed her how to hold the pistol, his hands covering hers for a brief, startling moment. His touch was all business, adjusting her grip, showing her how to brace her arm. Yet, the warmth of his skin against hers sent a jolt through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the midday sun. "It has a kick," he warned her. "Let your arm ride with it. Do not fight it." The gun was heavier than she had expected, a solid, unforgiving weight in her hand. The first time she pulled the trigger, the explosion was a deafening roar that seemed to rip the quiet air in two. The recoil slammed her shoulder back, and the shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet from the target. Her ears rang, and the smell of gunpowder, acrid and sharp, filled her nostrils. "Again," was all he said. She fired again and again. Slowly, she began to get the feel of it, the rhythm of the kick, the precise moment the hammer would fall. She began to anticipate it, to control it. Her focus narrowed to the front sight of the pistol and the glint of the sun on the tin can. On the 7th shot, the can jumped from the post with a satisfying ping, landing in the dust. She lowered the gun, her arm trembling from the strain, and looked at Caleb. A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even a sliver of respect, passed through his guarded eyes before being extinguished. "You are a quick learner," he said. It was the closest he had ever come to giving her a compliment. She found that the daily practice became a ritual. There was something empowering in the solid weight of the gun, in the knowledge that she was not entirely defenseless. It was a grim sort of power, born of a grim necessity, but it was hers. And as she learned to handle the weapon, she saw a change in the way Caleb looked at her. It was subtle, a slight lessening of the distance in his eyes. He was still her keeper, the man who had bought her. But now, she was something more than just a helpless piece of property. The shared knowledge of the gun was a new, unspoken language between them. It surprised her, this unexpected aptitude for a tool of violence, and she knew, from the way he watched her, that it surprised him, too. Autumn bled into the gray, stark landscape of late fall. The wind grew teeth, and the sky took on the color of lead. The threat of winter was a constant, low hum on the horizon. Then, one afternoon, it arrived. Not slowly, but with a sudden, savage fury. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue an hour earlier, turned a churning, bruised purple. The wind began to howl, a rising, mournful shriek that seemed to come from the throat of the prairie itself. Then the snow began, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal sheet, a white monster that devoured the world. A blizzard. Caleb had been out checking the horses, and he made it back to the cabin just as the full force of the storm hit, his duster and hat caked in white, his eyebrows frosted over. He slammed the door shut, barring it against the screaming wind, and the world outside disappeared. They were trapped. For 3 days, the storm raged. The wind never ceased its assault on the small cabin, which groaned and shuddered like a ship in a storm-tossed sea. The snow piled up against the walls, covering the single window, plunging them into a dim, perpetual twilight, lit only by the fire and the oil lamp. The world shrank to the 4 walls of that room. There was no sunrise, no sunset, no work to be done outside. There was only the fire, the howling wind, and each other. The forced proximity should have been a torment, another form of imprisonment. Instead, it became a crucible, the walls of silence, so carefully constructed over the past months, began to crumble under the immense pressure of the storm. It began slowly, with small, mundane offerings. He would pass her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing. She would mend a tear in his shirt, her head bent over her work, the firelight catching the dark sheen of her hair. On the second day, she found the courage to speak of the unspeakable. She sat on the floor by the hearth, watching the flames dance, and the words came out, quiet and halting, like ghosts being let out of a locked room. "The town, the people back in Redemption," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "They used to say my mother was mad." Caleb sat at the table, sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only other sound besides the wind. He did not stop his work, but she knew he was listening. "She was not mad," Eleanor continued, her gaze fixed on the fire. "She was just sad, a sadness so deep it swallowed her. She used to love lilacs. Our old house had a whole bush of them by the porch. After she was gone, my father tore it out. He said he could not stand the smell." She paused, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "They said the madness was in my blood, that I would end up like her." Caleb finally stopped sharpening the knife. He looked at her, his face half in shadow, his expression unreadable. "Fear makes people cruel," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not an absolution, but it was an acknowledgement of her pain, and it was more than anyone had ever given her. The next night, it was his turn. The storm had not abated. The wind clawed at the roof, and the small cabin felt like the last bastion of life in a dead, white world. He was staring into the fire, his hands clasped between his knees, a profound and terrible sorrow etched on his face. "The traitor," he said, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear him. "The one who came by. He told you about my brother, did not he?" Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She simply nodded. "He told you I let him burn." It was not a question. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "We were boys, not much older than colts, full of fire and foolishness. We were in the saloon. I was arguing with a man over a card game. I was drunk, stupid. I knocked a lamp over. I did not mean to. It was an accident." His voice cracked, the sound of a man breaking apart from the inside. "The whole place went up so fast, sawdust on the floor, whiskey everywhere. It was like a tinderbox. I got out. The smoke. I could not see. I was calling for him, for Thomas. But he never came out." He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. "I did not let him burn. I could not get back in to save him. I could not save him." He was not the monster from the Trader's Tale. He was just a boy who had made a terrible mistake, a man who had been carrying the weight of his brother's death, the crushing guilt of an accident, for years. Eleanor moved from her place on the floor and knelt before him. She did not know what to say, what comfort she could possibly offer for a wound so deep. So she simply reached out and placed her hand on his arm. He flinched at her touch, but he did not pull away. The confession broke something open between them. The heat that had been simmering just beneath the surface now rose, a palpable presence in the small, fire-lit room. Their stolen glances by the fire were no longer fleeting. They held, lingering for a heart-stopping moment too long. When he passed her the kettle, his hand would deliberately brush against hers, sending a shock of warmth through her veins. They talked more, sharing small stories of their pasts, slowly, carefully, like two wounded animals learning to trust again. On the third night of the storm, the wind finally began to die down, its howl softening to a low, mournful moan. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, red light on their faces. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, and she was on the hearth, a few feet away. The air was thick with unspoken words, with a longing so intense it was almost painful. He looked at her, his eyes dark and deep in the firelight. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a moment in the air between them, before he gently, tentatively, touched her cheek. His touch was as soft as a whisper, a question asked without words. A shiver ran through her, but she did not pull away. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes, allowing herself, for the first time, to feel the comfort of another person's touch without fear, without shame. He held his hand there for a long moment, his thumb stroking her skin, and then he let it fall away. That night, like all the nights before, he still slept on the floor. The storm broke the next morning. The world was a pristine, brilliant white. The snow so deep it came halfway up the cabin door. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the howling chaos of the past 3 days. As Caleb was digging a path to the corral, a rider appeared, a dark shape moving slowly through the vast, white expanse. It was a deputy marshal from Redemption, a man named Merritt. He brought with him a letter. "For you, ma'am," he said, handing the sealed envelope to Eleanor. "Came by way of the stage. From your cousin, back in Missouri." Eleanor took the letter, her fingers numb. A way out. The words screamed in her mind, a lifeline back to the world she had known, to family, to a life that was not this. She looked at Caleb. He stood by the corral, his face a stony mask, his eyes giving nothing away. He said nothing. He did not encourage her to read it, nor did he forbid it. He simply watched her, his silence a heavy weight. The choice, he was telling her, was hers alone. She clutched the letter in her hand, the crisp paper a stark and foreign object in her calloused palm. She thanked the deputy, who soon rode off, leaving a single track in the otherwise untouched snow. She stood there for a long time, the unopened letter a burning brand in her hand. She did not read it. That night, the conflict inside her became a physical pain. She felt as though she were being torn in two. One part of her screamed to tear open the letter, to embrace the promise of freedom, to escape this harsh land and the haunted man who had brought her to it. But another part, a quieter, more hesitant voice, could not bear the thought of leaving. It was a foolish, traitorous thought. This was not a life she had chosen. This was not love. It was a slow-burning bond forged in silence and survival. But it was real. She fled the cabin, unable to breathe in the suffocating closeness of her own indecision, and sought refuge in the cold, dark barn. She sank down into the hay, the unopened letter still clutched in her hand, and finally let the tears come. She wept for the girl who had been sold, for the woman who was too afraid to be free, and for the impossible choice that lay before her. The barn door creaked open, letting in a sliver of moonlight. Caleb stood in the opening, a dark silhouette against the snow. He walked over to where she sat, his footsteps silent in the hay. He did not speak. He simply took off his heavy duster and draped it over her shoulders, its warmth and his scent enveloping her. He sat down beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the solid presence of him in the darkness. He held her then, not in passion, but in a gesture of pure, unadulterated comfort, his arms wrapping around her as she trembled, sheltering her from the cold. He did not try to kiss her. He did not offer any words of advice. He simply held her, a quiet, steady anchor in the storm of her own heart. After a long time, her tears subsided. She leaned her head back against his chest, the rough wool of his shirt scratching her cheek. "Why?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice raw. "Why will not you touch me?" His arms tightened around her for a brief moment. His voice, when he finally answered, was a low, rough murmur against her hair. "Not until you smile for yourself, Eleanor, not for me." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He did not want her submission. He did not want a wife who was his property, a woman who smiled to please her keeper. He wanted her to be whole. He wanted her to be free, not just from this ranch, but from the ghosts of her past. He wanted her to find a happiness that was truly her own. She pulled away from him and stood up. She walked out of the barn, leaving his duster behind, and back toward the cabin. The snow was cold beneath her bare feet, a sharp, cleansing pain. The firelight from the cabin spilled out onto the snow, painting it in shades of orange and gold. She stopped in the doorway, the light on her face, and turned to look at him as he followed her out of the barn. And there, in the flickering firelight, with the vast, cold emptiness of the prairie behind her, she gave him just a flicker of a smile. It was not a smile of gratitude or of submission. It was not forced. It was small and fragile, and it was hers. Spring arrived not with a gentle announcement, but with the steady, insistent trickle of melting snow. It was a sound of release, a loosening of winter's grip. The hard, frozen earth softened, and a pale green fuzz began to emerge on the endless brown plains, a shy promise of life returning. The air lost its cutting edge, carrying instead the scent of damp earth and the distant, cheerful chirping of meadowlarks. The thaw was not confined to the land. Inside the small, weathered cabin, the frozen silence that had defined their existence for so long began to melt away, replaced by a tentative, fragile warmth. Their daily chores, once performed in a state of solitary endurance, became points of quiet connection. When Eleanor went out to milk the goat in the misty dawn, Caleb would often be there, leaning against the corral fence, a silent sentinel in the half-light. He never offered to help, but his presence was a comfort, a shared acknowledgement of the day's beginning. The work became a language of its own. He would leave a perfectly stacked pile of split firewood by the door without a word. She would leave a hot mug of coffee on the porch rail for him in return. Meals were no longer consumed in tense silence on opposite sides of the room. One evening, without discussion, he simply sat down at the table where she was eating. It was a silent treaty, an unspoken agreement that the floor was no longer his designated place. The small, rough-hewn table became shared territory, a place where their hands might brush when passing the salt, where their eyes might meet over the rim of a cup. The touches, once accidental and startling, now lingered for a heartbeat longer. His hand would cover hers on the handle of the water pump, a brief, deliberate pressure that was both a steadying gesture and something more. When she handed him a plate, his fingers would graze hers, a spark of warmth that would travel up her arm and settle in her chest. These small, fleeting moments of contact were charged with all the words they still did not know how to say. Jokes, dry and sparse as the prairie itself, began to surface. The yellow-eyed goat became a source of shared amusement, its stubborn refusal to be milked some mornings eliciting a rare, low chuckle from Caleb, and a genuine laugh from Eleanor. The sound of her laughter, clear and unburdened in the quiet cabin, would make him stop what he was doing and look at her with that same lost expression she had seen after the storm, as if he were witnessing a miracle. The cabin itself began to change, to shed its skin of grim functionality and take on the shape of a home. Eleanor, tired of the bare, drafty window, found a stash of old flour sacks. She washed them until they were soft and bleached by the sun, and with a needle and thread traded from Jedediah, she sewed simple, clean curtains. The day she hung them, the harsh afternoon light was transformed into a soft, diffused glow, and the room felt gentler, more welcoming. Caleb, for his part, began to mend the things he had long let slide. He spent 2 days on the roof, replacing shingles that had been torn loose by the winter winds. The constant, rhythmic sound of his hammer was a reassuring presence, the sound of a man building, of a man staying. The cabin was no longer just his shelter or her prison. It was becoming their shared space, a small fortress against the vast, empty land, a place they were both, in their own quiet ways, choosing to inhabit. As the trails dried and the prairie turned a vibrant, hopeful green, the need for supplies became pressing. The sacks of flour and beans were nearly empty, and the salt was gone. The trip to redemption was unavoidable. Eleanor felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach at the thought of returning to that place of judgment and whispers. "I will go with you," she said, her voice firm. It was not a request. Caleb looked at her, his expression considering. He simply nodded. "Get your coat." The journey to town was different this time. They sat side by side on the buckboard, a comfortable silence between them. It was not the crushing, hostile silence of their first journey, but a shared quiet. The silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand each other. They were a united front, and the thought gave Eleanor a small, surprising surge of strength. Redemption had not changed. It was still a place of dust and quiet resentment. As they pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, the curtain of a nearby window twitched. Faces appeared in doorways, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The whispers started immediately, a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves skittering across a hard-packed street. "There's Rourke. And the Whitmore girl. Looks like he ain't broke her yet." Eleanor felt a hot flush of shame and anger. She saw how they looked at her, not as a person, but as a thing, a piece of property Caleb had acquired. She stiffened, her hands clenching into fists. But then she felt Caleb's presence beside her, a solid, unmovable wall. He seemed oblivious to the stairs, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his quiet strength a shield that deflected the town's venom. He did not treat her like property. His steady presence beside her was a silent declaration that she was with him, and that was all that mattered. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand on her elbow, a simple, public gesture of possession and protection. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and unspoken judgment. The storekeeper, a man with a perpetually sour expression, served them with a grudging slowness, his eyes constantly darting from Caleb to Eleanor and back again. It was then that a voice, slick with false bonhomie, cut through the tense quiet. Well, if it is not Eleanor Whitmore, or should I say Rourke, now. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She turned to see Harvey Bell leaning against the counter, a smug, superior smirk on his face. Harvey had been a suitor of hers once, before her father's fall, a man whose soft hands and flattering words had always made her skin crawl. He represented everything she despised about her old life, the hypocrisy, the shallow judgments, the belief that a woman's worth was tied to her father's name and fortune. Caleb, who had been examining a set of harnesses, slowly turned. His face was a blank canvas, but his eyes had gone flat and cold, like chips of winter ice. Harvey's smirk widened, his gaze sliding over Eleanor in a way that made her feel cheap and exposed. "Rourke," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I must say, I'm surprised to see you in town. I heard you preferred the company of wild things." He looked pointedly at Eleanor. "Tell me, did you have to pay extra for her silence, or are all damaged goods so quiet?" The air in the store crackled. The insult, so casually, cruelly delivered, hung in the air like poison. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Damaged goods. The words were a brand, searing into her the shame of her mother's death, her father's debts, her own forced marriage. Caleb did not speak. He did not issue a warning. He simply moved. It was not a rush of anger, but a fluid, deliberate motion, as swift and silent as a striking snake. He took 2 steps and hit Harvey Bell with a single, brutal punch. It was not a brawler's sloppy swing, but a precise, economical blow, delivered with the full weight of his body. The sound was a wet, final crack, and Harvey collapsed to the floorboards in a boneless heap, a trickle of blood leaking from his nose. He did not get back up. The store fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The storekeeper's jaw hung open. Caleb stood over Harvey's unconscious form for a moment, his chest rising and falling with a single, deep breath. He was not angry. He was not triumphant. His face was as calm and still as a frozen lake. He turned, his icy gaze sweeping over the other men in the store, a silent, deadly warning. No one moved. No one spoke. He walked back to the counter, placed a few coins down for their supplies, and then looked at Eleanor. "Let's go," he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle. He led her out of the store, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The ride home was silent once more, but this was a new kind of silence, a heavy, troubled quiet, thick with the aftershock of violence. Eleanor stared straight ahead, the image of Harvey falling, the sound of the blow, replaying over and over in her mind. She was not frightened of Caleb, but she was frightened by the cold, efficient violence she had just witnessed, a violence that she knew was a deep and essential part of the man who sat beside her. That night, after their silent meal, she confronted him. He was standing by the open doorway, staring out at the twilight-shrouded prairie. "You did not have to do that," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. He did not turn to look at her. "Yes, I did." "Violence is not the answer," she insisted, walking to stand beside him. "It solves nothing." He was quiet for a long moment, the scent of the cooling earth and the first night-blooming flowers rising around them. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression raw and vulnerable in the dying light. "I know," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "Eleanor, I ain't proud of who I have been. I ain't proud of the things I have done." His eyes held hers, and she could see the ghosts of his past swirling in their stormy depths, the fire, the guilt, the long, lonely years of penance. "But no one talks to you like that. No one—" The raw honesty of his confession, the fierce, protective light in his eyes, broke down the last of her defenses. He was a man who had lived with violence, who knew its bitter taste, but he had used it for her, to defend her, to claim her in a way that had nothing to do with debts or transactions. The passion that had been simmering between them for months, a slow-burning fire of stolen glances and lingering touches, finally erupted. The space between them vanished. He reached for her, his hands framing her face, his calloused thumbs stroking her cheeks. He looked at her as if he were drowning and she was his only hope of air. "I ain't never wanted something good till you," he whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the admission. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and longing, of a thirst that had gone unslaked for a lifetime. It was fierce and deep, and it tasted of sorrow and hope and the dust of the prairie. She answered him with a ferocity that matched his own, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, her hands tangling in his thick, dark hair. This was not a surrender. It was a claiming. They spent the night together, in the narrow bed with the patched quilt that had once been only hers. Their coming together was not rushed, not rough. It was an aching, slow discovery, a mapping of scars both seen and unseen. It was a quiet, desperate prayer offered up in the darkness, the gentle, loving act of two broken things finding a way to be whole in each other's arms. It was like people who had lost too much to love carelessly. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar warmth of another body beside her. She lay for a long moment, tangled in the sheets with Caleb, his arm draped protectively over her waist, his steady breathing a comforting presence in the quiet dawn. A feeling of profound, terrifying peace settled over her. Later, as she was dressing, Caleb, who was rekindling the fire, noticed the letter from her cousin, lying unopened on the small crate that served as a nightstand. He picked it up, his expression unreadable, and held it out to her. "Will you read it now?" he asked, his voice quiet. It was not a challenge, not a demand. It was a question, a final, honest offering of her freedom. The choice was still hers. Eleanor looked at the letter in his hand, the promise of another life, a life without hardship, without a haunted, violent man, a life that was safe, and she knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it was not the life she wanted. She looked up at him, at his weathered face, at the stormy eyes that held a lifetime of pain and a dawning of hope. She reached out and placed her hand over his, gently pushing the letter away. "No," she said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. "I am already home." The fragile peace they had built was as beautiful and precarious as a spider's web in the morning dew. The days of early summer unfolded in a rhythm of shared work and quiet companionship. They were no longer two separate souls rattling around in a cage of solitude, but a single entity, a partnership etched into the routines of the ranch. The cabin, once a symbol of her imprisonment, was now a sanctuary. Its small space a comfort rather than a confinement. The curtains she had sewn softened the harsh light, and the scent of the bread she baked in the mornings mingled with the familiar smell of wood smoke and leather, creating a scent that was uniquely, profoundly, home. Their love, having taken root in the frozen ground of winter, now blossomed in the long, warm days. It was a quiet, sturdy thing, not given to grand pronouncements or flowery words. It lived in the way he would watch her from the corral, a small, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes. It was in the way she would bring him a dipper of cool water in the heat of the day, her hand brushing his as he took it. It was in the shared laughter over a clumsy calf, and the comfortable silence as they sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set the prairie ablaze with color. She had found a home, not just in the cabin, but in the quiet, steady presence of the man who had bought her. And he, a man who had lived his life as a ghost, was finally learning how to inhabit the world again, anchored by the woman who saw not his past, but the good, solid heart of him. The harbinger of the past's return was, as it so often is, a whisper. Jedediah, the wandering trader, arrived one sun-bleached afternoon, his wagon groaning under a new load of wares. He was a welcome sight, a link to the outside world that no longer felt so threatening. But as Eleanor traded for coffee and sugar, the old man's gossip took a dark turn. "Words come down the line from Abilene," he said, his voice low, his eyes darting toward Caleb, who was mending a harness by the barn. "A man named Silas Blackwood, big man, with a long memory and a longer reach, owned the saloon that burned down, the one where your man's brother died. Seems Blackwood lost a fortune in that fire, not just the building but a strong box full of cash. He never believed it was an accident. He's put a private bounty out, $1,000 for the man who lit the match, and he's hired a hunter to collect it." The bag of sugar felt impossibly heavy in Eleanor's hands. The world, which had seemed so full of light and promise a moment before, suddenly went gray at the edges. A bounty hunter, a man paid to hunt other men. The words were a death knell, a final, fatal echo from a past Caleb had never truly escaped. That night, the easy quiet in the cabin was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Eleanor watched Caleb clean his rifle, the same methodical motions he had performed the day she had first confronted him about buying her. But now, the sight of the gun filled her not with resentment, but with a cold, creeping dread. "We have to leave," she said, the words coming out in a rushed, desperate torrent. "We can pack the wagon tonight. Go west, California, maybe somewhere they will not find you. We can start over. Caleb, for real, this time." He did not look up from his work. "No." The single word was as solid and unmovable as a mountain. "No?" she repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "What do you mean? No, a man is coming to kill you, Caleb, for something that happened when you were just a boy, an accident." "It does not matter if it was an accident," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a weary, unshakable resolve. "It happened, and I was the one who did it." "So you will just stay here and let him kill you?" she cried, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "After everything, after we have finally found this?" He stood up and walked to her, his large frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. He reached out, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Eleanor," he said, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "Running is what I have been doing my whole life. Out here, alone, hiding from what I did, from who I was. That ain't living. It is just waiting for the past to catch up. I am done waiting. I am done running." Tears of frustration and fear streamed down her face. "I will not let you do this," she whispered fiercely. "I will not lose you." "You will not lose me," he said, his gaze unwavering. "But I will lose myself if I run now. This is not about Silas Blackwood. This is about Thomas. This is about the boy I was, and the man I need to be. I have to face this here, on my own ground." She saw then that it was useless to argue. This was not a choice born of pride or foolishness, but of a deep, fundamental need to finally, completely, atone. To run now would be to unravel everything he had become, to betray the man she had come to love. The next day, driven by a desperate hope, she rode to redemption. The town no longer held any fear for her. Her own troubles seemed small and insignificant compared to the life-and-death struggle that was about to play out on the prairie. She went straight to the office of the town marshal, a weary-looking man named Davies, with tired, but decent, eyes. She explained the situation, her voice steady and clear, laying out the story of the fire as Caleb had told it to her. An accident, a boy's drunken mistake, not a crime of malice. Marshal Davies listened patiently, his hands steepled on his cluttered desk. When she had finished, he sighed, a long, heavy sound of regret. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, Mrs. Rourke, I believe you. And from what I saw in front of the general store a few weeks back, I believe your husband is a man who stands up for what's his. But the law is a stubborn thing. There is an old warrant for arson out of Abilene with his name on it, and this bounty, it is a private matter, perfectly legal. If this hunter brings him in, dead or alive, my hands are tied. He will have to stand trial. But it was an accident, she insisted. The truth, Mrs. Rourke, the marshal said, his eyes full of a sad wisdom, has a way of getting burned up in a fire just like everything else. All that is left is the law's version of the story. And that story says your husband is a wanted man. I am sorry. There is nothing I can do. She rode back to the ranch with a heart as heavy as stone. The last flicker of hope had been extinguished. Caleb's fate was coming for him, and there was nowhere to hide. That night was a quiet agony. They moved through the evening chores with a poignant, heartbreaking tenderness. Every simple act, the passing of a plate, the stoking of the fire, the brushing of their hands, was imbued with the terrible weight of a potential finality. They did not speak of the morning. To speak of it would be to make it real. Later, they lay in bed, not in passion, but in a desperate, clinging embrace, trying to absorb a lifetime of warmth and comfort from a single night. The moon cast a pale, sorrowful light through the window, tracing the lines of Caleb's weathered face. Eleanor reached up, her fingers tracing the scar above his eyebrow, the deep lines etched by sun and sorrow. She felt the steady, solid beat of his heart against her own, a rhythm she was terrified she would never feel again. She thought of the broken, terrified girl she had been when she arrived here, a piece of property sold to settle a debt. She thought of the woman she was now, strong, capable, and fiercely in love. "They sold me to you," she whispered into the quiet darkness, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Like a deed to a piece of land, but you never tried to own me. You just cleared the ground and let me grow. You gave me back to myself. Caleb." He pulled her closer, his face buried in her hair, his body trembling with the force of his own unspoken emotions. They held each other like that for the rest of the night, two souls clinging together on the edge of an abyss, while the moon crept across the sky and the dawn drew inexorably closer. It arrived as a cold, gray line on the eastern horizon. With it came a rider, a single man on a tall, black horse, moving with an unhurried, predatory grace. He was not a blustering villain, but something far more dangerous, a professional. He was lean and dressed in black, his face impassive, his eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. Caleb was already outside, waiting. He stood in the open space between the cabin and the corral, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He had not kissed her goodbye. He had simply squeezed her hand, a silent message of love and finality, and walked out to meet his past. The rider pulled his horse to a stop 20 yards away. "Rourke," the man called out, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "That is me," Caleb answered, his own voice steady. "Got paper on you for a fire in Abilene. Name's Ames." "That was a long time ago," Caleb said. "Not for Silas Blackwood," Ames replied. He swung down from his horse, a rifle of his own appearing in his hands as if by magic. "You can come with me easy, or you can come with me hard. It is all the same to Blackwood." "I am not going anywhere," Caleb said. And then the world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. It was over in seconds. It was not a prolonged, dramatic duel, but a swift, brutal exchange of violence. Caleb was fast, the shot from his rifle kicking up dust near Ames's feet. But Ames was faster. He fired once, the sound a sharp, vicious crack. Caleb cried out, a sound of pained surprise, and staggered back, clutching his side. He tried to raise his rifle again, but his strength failed him, and he sank to his knees, then collapsed onto the hard, unforgiving ground. Ames began to walk forward, his rifle leveled at Caleb's prone form, a cold, professional calm on his face. Then, the cabin door flew open. Eleanor stood in the doorway, the heavy Colt revolver in her hands. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror, but the gun in her hands did not tremble. She raised it, both hands gripping the stock, and leveled it at the bounty hunter's chest. The hours of practice, the muscle memory, took over. "Get away from him," she said, her voice clear and cold and utterly without fear. Ames stopped, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. He looked at her, at the small, determined woman in the doorway, and a humorless smirk touched his lips. "This ain't your fight, little lady. Put the gun down before you get hurt." He took another step forward. "I said, get away from him," she repeated, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. She pulled back the hammer on the Colt, the sound a loud, definitive click in the sudden, tense silence. "Try me." There was no bluff in her eyes. There was only a cold, murderous certainty. Ames was a man who calculated risks for a living, and as he looked at the woman before him, at her steady hands and her unwavering gaze, he saw a risk that was not worth the reward. He saw a woman who had nothing left to lose, a woman who would die to protect the man on the ground, and who would most certainly take him with her. It was at that moment that two more riders appeared over the rise, Marshal Davies and one of his deputies. They had been drawn by the sound of the shots, the marshal's conscience having gotten the better of him. They pulled their horses to a stop, taking in the scene, Caleb wounded on the ground, the bounty hunter standing over him, and the fierce, unyielding woman holding them all at bay. The whole town, it seemed, had followed, a silent, watching gallery of faces peering from a safe distance. The marshal dismounted, his shotgun held at the ready. "That is enough, Ames," he called out. "Let it be." Ames hesitated for a moment, his cold eyes darting from the marshal to Eleanor. He had lost his advantage. With a curse, he lowered his rifle, spat on the ground, and turned back to his horse. He mounted up, gave Eleanor one last, grudging look of respect, and rode away, a black specter disappearing back into the prairie. The town watched it all. They saw the quiet, haunted man, Caleb Rourke, willing to stand and die on his own land rather than run. And they saw the woman they had once called damaged goods stand like a lioness over her mate, her courage a blazing fire that held death itself at bay. Marshal Davies walked over to where Eleanor now knelt beside Caleb, the Colt forgotten in the dust beside her. He looked down at them, his weary face filled with a profound and unexpected emotion. "You want peace," he said, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "You have earned it, both of you. Do not give me a reason to regret this." He turned to the silent crowd. "Go on home. The show is over." Back in the cabin, the adrenaline faded, leaving behind the stark, terrifying reality of the wound. Caleb was alive, but the bullet had torn through his side, and a fever was already beginning to set in. He lay in their bed, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his breathing shallow. Blood seeped through the crude bandage she had fashioned. Eleanor worked with a desperate focus, cleaning the wound as he had once cleaned hers, her hands moving with a sureness she had not known she possessed. And as she worked, she wept. The tears were not for the fear she had felt, but for the fierce, overwhelming love that filled her to the bursting point. This man, this quiet, broken, beautiful man, was hers. She leaned down, her tears falling onto his pale cheek, and whispered, her voice a raw, ragged vow in the quiet room. "You are mine now, and I ain't letting go." The summer that followed was a season of slow healing, as Caleb's wound mended, stitching itself together with painful, stubborn slowness. The prairie did the same. The land, washed clean by the spring rains, exploded into life. The endless sea of green deepened, punctuated by the vibrant colors of Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans, and wild sunflowers. The sun beat down, a benevolent warmth now, not a punishing force, and turned the vast grasslands to a shimmering, rippling ocean of gold. Eleanor was his constant shadow, his nurse, his partner, the roles they had once inhabited, keeper and captive, stranger and stranger, had been burned away in the fire of that violent dawn. Now, they were simply a man and a woman, bound by something stronger than any contract. She changed his bandages, her touch gentle and sure. She brewed willow bark tea for his fever, her presence a quiet, constant comfort through the long, painful nights. He was a difficult patient, proud and frustrated by his own weakness, but he submitted to her care with a gruff, reluctant gratitude that was more eloquent than any words of thanks. As his strength returned, he began to work the land again, but not alone. Eleanor was beside him. They mended fences together, her smaller hands surprisingly deft with the baling wire. They worked the small vegetable patch she had insisted on planting, their hands sinking into the same dark, rich earth. The daily chores were no longer solitary burdens, but a shared rhythm, a quiet dance of partnership. He taught her how to read the clouds for rain, how to tell a horse's mood by the flick of its ear. She taught him, in turn, how to find beauty in the small, overlooked things, the intricate pattern of a beetle's shell, the way the morning glories she had planted by the door opened to the sun. Word of what had happened at the Rourke Ranch traveled on the wind. Carried by traders and wandering farmhands, the story grew and changed with each telling, as such stories do, but the core of it remained the same: the quiet, haunted man who had refused to run, and the fierce woman who had stood down a killer with a gun in her hand and ice in her veins. Their isolation, once a mark of shame and suspicion, was transformed into something else. The ranch became a quiet legend, a place of sanctuary on the vast, unforgiving plains. It began with the animals. A three-legged coyote, shunned by its pack, began to leave offerings of hunted rabbits on their porch. A mare with a lame foal, abandoned by a passing wagon train, found its way to their corral. Eleanor and Caleb took them in without discussion. Their shared compassion and unspoken creed, the small ranch, once a place of stark survival, began to accumulate life, to become a refuge for the broken and the lost. Then came the people. They were whispers at first, rumors of a place where a person could find a moment's peace, a hot meal, and no questions asked. A young boy, no older than 15, running from a cruel apprenticeship in redemption, appeared at their door one evening, his eyes wide with fear and hunger. Eleanor fed him, mended his torn shirt, and Caleb gave him a bed in the barn for a few nights, until the boy had the strength and courage to move on. The most profound echo of Eleanor's own past arrived in late summer, in the form of a girl named Lily. She was a slip of a thing, with hair the color of corn silk and eyes that held the terrified, hunted look of a rabbit in a snare. She stumbled up to the cabin one afternoon, her dress torn, a dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheek. She was a mail-order bride. She explained in a halting, terrified whisper, sent for by a farmer some 20 miles to the east. She had endured 2 weeks of his drunken rages and rough, bruising hands before finding the courage to flee in the dead of night. Eleanor looked at this girl, at her trembling hands and her downcast eyes, and saw a reflection of the ghost she had once been. She saw the same suffocating despair, the same feeling of being a piece of property, a thing to be used and discarded. A fierce, protective anger rose in her, so powerful it almost stole her breath. She took Lily inside, her arm wrapped around the girl's thin, shaking shoulders. She drew her a bath, gave her a clean dress, and sat with her while she ate, her quiet, reassuring presence a balm on the girl's raw terror. She did not press for details. She simply offered safety. When Caleb came in from the corral, he stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the strange girl at his table, the fierce, protective set of his wife's jaw. Eleanor met his gaze, a silent challenge in her eyes. He simply nodded, his expression softening, and went to fetch a fresh blanket for the bed in the barn. Lily stayed with them for a month, slowly regaining her strength and her spirit under Eleanor's gentle care when she was finally ready to leave, to take the stagecoach back to a cousin in Ohio. She hugged Eleanor with a desperate gratitude. "No one has ever been so kind," Lily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Everyone deserves kindness," Eleanor answered, her voice thick with emotion. "And no one has the right to treat you like a thing they own. Remember that." Caleb's transformation was quieter, but no less profound. The story of his stand against the bounty hunter had earned him a new, grudging respect in the surrounding area. Men who had once shunned him now sought his advice on horses, or the best way to track a mountain lion. One day, a neighboring farmer, a man named Peterson, rode over with his timid 14-year-old son in tow. "Rourke," the farmer said, twisting his hat in his hands. "My boy, Jacob, he's a good lad, but he's afraid of his own shadow. I was hoping you might teach him to ride proper, to shoot." Caleb looked at the boy, who was staring at his own feet, and saw a reflection of the fear that had once ruled his own life. He agreed. Jacob began to come to the ranch twice a week. Caleb was a patient, demanding teacher. He taught the boy not just how to handle a horse, but how to understand it, how to earn its trust. The most significant lesson came one afternoon by the fire pit. Caleb built a small, controlled blaze. He had Jacob sit beside him, close enough to feel the heat. He talked about the fire, not as a monster, but as a tool, a force of nature that demanded respect. "Fear is a liar," Caleb said, his voice low and steady as he stared into the flames, his own ghosts swirling in the heat haze. "It tells you that you are weak, that you have no control, but you do. You feed the fire, you starve it, you tell it where to go. You have to respect it, but you do not have to be its slave." He looked at the boy, his stormy eyes clear and direct. "You are the one who decides how big the fire gets. In here," he said, tapping his own chest. "And out here." In that moment, he was not just teaching the boy, he was healing himself, finally claiming mastery over the demon that had haunted him for a lifetime. Their newfound peace was not without its trials. A long, brutal drought settled over the plains that summer, turning the golden grasses to a dry, brittle brown. The small creek that watered their stock slowed to a trickle. The corn in their garden withered on the stalk. To the west, a greedy, hard-eyed rancher named Jebediah Stone, seeing their vulnerability, decided to test their resolve. He built a crude dam, diverting the last of the creek's water for his own cattle, and then moved his fence line, claiming a 20-acre parcel of their grazing land. The Caleb of old might have met this challenge with violence, but he was a different man now. He and Eleanor rode over to Stone's ranch together. They did not carry rifles. They stood before the belligerent, red-faced man, their presence a quiet, unyielding wall of unity. "That is our water, Mr. Stone," Caleb said, his voice calm and even. "And that is our land. You know it, and I know it. Take down the dam, and move your fence back." Stone laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Or what? Rourke, you will punch me like you did Harvey Bell? I am not some drunken fop." "No," Caleb said. "I will not, but Marshal Davies will be out here tomorrow with the official survey maps, and he will have a signed complaint from me. You can deal with him, and with the court, or you can be a good neighbor and move the fence." Faced not with a brawl he could win, but with the unshakable certainty of the law and the united front of the couple before him, Stone backed down. They had held firm, not with fists, but with a strength born of their partnership and their hard-won place in the community. One evening in the late summer, as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, soft shadows across the land, Eleanor walked out to the small, gnarled oak tree on the rise behind the cabin. In her hands, she carried a second wooden marker, one she had spent the afternoon carving herself. It was simple, unadorned, with no name on it. Caleb followed her, his footsteps quiet in the dry grass. He stood beside her as she knelt and pushed the new marker into the earth, right beside the one that read Thomas. She looked at the two crosses, standing side by side, silent witnesses to all that had been lost and all that had been found. "For the girl I used to be," she said softly, her voice catching in her throat. "The one who was sold, the one who was so afraid. She is buried here, too." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He reached down and placed his hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. A small, genuine smile touched his lips, a smile that finally, truly, reached his eyes. "She was strong," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "But you are something fiercer." In the final scene of their story, as written by the wind and the dust, they rode together at dusk. The sky was a breathtaking canvas of violet and rose and molten gold. Their horses moved at a slow, easy pace, their path taking them along the ridge that overlooked the small, twinkling light of their home. A comfortable silence settled between them, the silence of two hearts that beat as one. A cool evening breeze swept up from the prairie, carrying the scent of sage and dry grass. It rustled Eleanor's hair, and she threw her head back and laughed. It was not a small, hesitant sound, but a full, clear, and joyous laugh, the sound of a woman who was utterly, completely free. The last rays of the setting sun caught her face, illuminating her in a halo of golden light. Caleb reined in his horse, his gaze fixed on her, his heart filled with a love so profound it ached. "Smile like that again," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion that was almost reverence. "And I might just believe I deserve it." She turned to him, her own eyes shining with unshed tears of pure happiness. She reached out, her hand finding his, their fingers lacing together. "You do," she answered, her voice soft but certain. "You always did. And somewhere between the wind and the dust, in the heart of a land that had seen so much sorrow, love took root and stayed." Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West Campfire. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from to connect with each other. Subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts with us in English.